When a CEO goes undercover as a trucker to investigate millions in missing funds, he's thrust into a deadly game of sabotage and lies. But after a brutal ambush leaves him stranded, an unlikely ally steps in, a disgraced veteran with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The sun was barely up when Paul Rourke, or at least the man now going by that name, climbed into the driver's seat of a worn-down semi-truck and let out a slow breath. The leather was cracked beneath him, the dashboard flickering with outdated gauges, and the air inside smelled faintly of eucalyptus car fresheners and something else he couldn't quite place. It was a far cry from the plush leather seats and floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. He glanced at the clipboard resting on the passenger seat, route details, delivery times, fuel logs. Everything looked normal on paper, but Paul knew better than to trust appearances. That's how companies bled money without ever realizing it. And right now, his company was bleeding. Millions gone every quarter. No clear pattern or obvious culprits. Just numbers slipping through the cracks like water through cupped hands. So there he was, trading boardrooms for big rigs, suits for steel-toe boots, and corporate lunches for gas station burritos. He gave himself 6 weeks to find answers. No bodyguards or executive privileges, no easy way out. If he wanted the truth, he had to earn it, 1 mile at a time. His first assignment was simple. Pick up a load of high-end electronics in Indianapolis and deliver it to a distribution hub just outside St. Louis. Nothing flashy, nothing risky. At least that's what the manifest said. Paul checked the seals on the trailer before climbing back into the cab. Everything seemed secure. As he pulled onto the highway, the city lights faded behind him, swallowed by darkness. The road stretched ahead like an endless thread, lined with trees and silence. He adjusted the rearview mirror, tapped the steering wheel, and settled into the rhythm of long-haul driving, the kind of work most people underestimate until they've done it themselves. First, everything felt routine. The hum of tires on asphalt, the occasional trucker chatter over the CB radio, the steady pulse of the engine beneath his feet. But then, things began to shift. His GPS glitched not once, but twice, rerouting him toward unfamiliar exits and unmarked roads. He ignored it the first time, assuming it was a software hiccup. But when it happened again, pulling him off the main interstate and into a stretch of highway flanked by dense forest, his stomach tightened. He manually re-entered the coordinates, but the device kept correcting itself, as if someone was overriding the system remotely. Paul switched it off. Better safe than sorry. Then the engine began to sputter. He frowned, checking the fuel gauge. Full. Oil pressure? Normal. Temperature? Fine. So why was the engine losing power? Before he could figure it out, the truck lurched and died. Paul barely managed to coast onto the shoulder, heart pounding. He killed the ignition and stepped out into the cool night air. There was nothing around but trees, shadows, and the distant echo of wind rustling through leaves. He grabbed his phone, no signal. Not even one bar. He opened the hood and inspected the engine bay. Something didn't look right. The fuel line was loose, almost disconnected entirely. He tugged at it gently, and the connection gave way more easily than it should. Someone tampered with it. Deliberately. A cold wave of realization washed over him. This wasn't a mechanical failure. It was sabotage. Before he could process what that meant, headlights appeared in the distance. A vehicle approached slowly, its wheels crunching against the gravel. Paul squinted, trying to make out the make and model. A black van, windows tinted, no company logo, no markings. His instincts screamed danger. The van pulled to a stop a few yards behind him. 2 figures stepped out, one tall, one shorter, both wearing dark clothing and keeping their faces mostly hidden under hoods. Paul didn't wait to find out their intentions. He jumped back into the cab, slammed the door shut, and fumbled with the ignition. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. The taller man reached for the door handle. Just as he did, another sound cut through the night. The deep growl of a diesel engine. Headlights flared from the opposite direction, blinding everyone. A massive rig roared onto the scene, tires screeching as it skidded to a halt between Paul and the 2 strangers. A man stepped out, older, grizzled, with eyes that had seen too much and a posture that said he was ready for anything. "Need a hand?" the stranger asked, voice rough like gravel. Paul barely managed a nod before the two figures retreated into the van, engines roaring as they disappeared down the highway. Whoever they were, they weren't interested in a confrontation. Not with this guy. The older driver introduced himself as Robert. He didn't ask questions, just gave Paul a hard look, then tossed him a bottle of water. "You don't belong here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Paul tried to play it off with a grin. "Guess I'm just getting started." Robert didn't respond. He got back into his truck and waited until Paul coasted his dead rig onto flat ground before hooking up a tow cable. Together, they headed toward town. As they drove, Paul watched Robert closely. He was a really skilled driver. You could tell by the way he handled the wheel, constantly checked the mirrors, and always seemed to know what was going to happen next. This wasn't just some aging trucker taking the forgotten routes. There was something deeper beneath the surface. And Robert? He stayed quiet, but he saw through the disguise. Something seemed off with Paul. His little pauses, how he was standing, and the way he was speaking so carefully all suggested things weren't quite right. He knew Paul wasn't who he claimed to be. But for now, he said nothing. The road was quiet again, but the silence between Paul and Robert carried weight. The kind that only comes after a man has seen too much and said too little. They drove side by side for hours, two rigs moving through the night like ghosts on asphalt. Paul had followed Robert out of the woods, trusting instinct over reason. Now, somewhere near the Kentucky border, they pulled into a roadside diner with flickering lights and a sign that read, "Open all night," mostly. Inside, the air smelled like grease and old coffee. They sat in a cracked vinyl booth, far from the few other truckers scattered around the room. Robert stirred his coffee without drinking it. Paul watched him, trying to read the lines carved into the older man's face. Not just age, but something deeper. Pain, regret, maybe even rage. "You ever been betrayed?" Robert asked finally, voice low. Paul hesitated. "Not like you mean it." Robert gave a dry chuckle, eyes fixed on the window. "Yeah, you wouldn't be here if you had." He leaned back, fingers tapping the table once before falling still. "I was Army, combat engineer. Spent 8 years overseas doing things most people don't want to know about. Got medals, got commendations. Hell, I even saved a whole unit once when an IED hit our convoy. But one bad call, or at least what they said was a bad call, wiped all of it away." Paul didn't speak. He could feel the story building like a storm rolling in. "They said I leaked intel," Robert continued. "Passed classified data to the wrong people during a joint op. No evidence. Just whispers. Enough to ruin me. Court-martialed. Discharged. Name dragged through the mud." His jaw tightened. "Funny thing is, I didn't do it. But no one cared. Once the system turns on you, you're done. So I came home. Tried to disappear. Trucking gives you that. The open road doesn't ask questions." Paul studied him carefully. There was no bitterness in his tone. Not exactly. More like resignation. A man who'd made peace with the fact that the world saw him as guilty, whether he was or not. "And now?" Paul asked. "You trust anyone?" Robert looked at him, like he was peeling back layers. "I trust my instincts," he said. "And right now, they tell me you're not who you say you are." Paul felt his pulse spike, but he kept his face neutral. Robert sipped his coffee. "But you're not dangerous. Not to me. So we'll keep driving. For now." Back on the road, the mood shifted. Paul couldn't stop thinking about what Robert had said. About betrayal, about being framed. It wasn't hard to see the parallels. He, too, was hiding who he really was. And if someone inside his company was stealing millions, how long before they decided he knew too much? That question became terrifyingly real less than an hour later. They were cruising down a stretch of highway, the moon casting silver light across the asphalt, when headlights flared behind them. Fast, aggressive. At first, Paul thought it was just another driver passing in a hurry. Then he noticed the pattern. One truck, sticking close, too close. "Something's off," Robert muttered, glancing at his rear view. Paul turned to look just as the vehicle slammed into the back of his rig. Hard. "Damn it!" he shouted, fighting the wheel as the impact sent his trailer fishtailing. Robert swerved beside him, shouting over the radio, "They're pushing you off the road." Another hit. This time, the rig lurched sideways, tires skimming dangerously close to the guardrail. Paul gripped the wheel, heart hammering. Whoever was behind them wasn't playing games. "Hold tight," Robert growled. Without warning, he veered sharply into the left lane, cutting off traffic ahead and forcing their pursuer to brake hard. Paul seized the opening, yanking the wheel and accelerating past Robert's truck. The move threw off their attacker's timing, just enough. But the driver recovered fast. A third attempt came, this time from the side. The mystery truck rammed Paul's trailer, trying to push him into the ditch. Then Robert did something Paul didn't expect. He signaled, then suddenly braked, dropping speed just enough to let the attacker pass. As soon as the blacked-out semi moved up, Robert cut in behind it. "What are you doing?" Paul yelled over the comms. "Getting a good look," Robert shot back. Through the windshield, Paul caught a glimpse of the cab. 2 men inside, one steering, one watching the road like a hawk. No plates, no markings. They weren't random hijackers. This was planned. Suddenly, the attacker's brake lights flashed, and the truck swerved violently toward Robert's door. Robert reacted instantly, yanking the wheel and slamming the gas. His rig leapt forward, narrowly avoiding a collision. The attacker cursed. Paul could see it in the glare of the headlights, and peeled off into a side road, disappearing into the trees. Silence fell again. Heavy. Electric. Paul exhaled, hands shaking. "That wasn't a robbery," he said. "That was a message." Robert nodded slowly. "Someone knows you're sniffing around." Paul stared at the dark road ahead, mind racing. If this was happening within days of going undercover, then the rot inside his company wasn't just deep. It was everywhere. The ambush on the highway left more than just adrenaline in its wake. It left a trail. And Paul wasn't about to let it go cold. Back at the terminal, he and Robert played their roles well. Paul kept his head down, clocked in for routes, and logged every suspicious detail into a hidden journal. Meanwhile, Robert maintained his usual silence, but Paul could see the gears turning behind those sharp eyes. He was watching. Always. It was Robert who first pointed out the pattern. Certain trucks were being rerouted last minute, always under the guise of weather or traffic delays. But when cross-referenced with GPS logs and delivery confirmations, something didn't add up. Deliveries were marked as complete, but the cargo never arrived. Paul had seen enough spreadsheets in boardrooms to know what that meant. Theft. Organized, methodical, and internal. "We need to follow one," Paul said quietly as they sat in the diner again. 2 nights later. Robert didn't look surprised. "You sure? I'm tired of waiting for someone to try killing me again." Robert gave him a long look, then nodded. They didn't have to wait long. A new shipment came through, standard freight, nothing classified. Or so the manifest claimed. But when Paul noticed the driver's name flagged in the system, route change approved by regional director, he knew this one was different. That night, instead of heading toward their assigned drop-off, Paul and Robert took a detour. Using a borrowed van from a mechanic friend of Robert's, a wiry guy named Walter who asked no questions and fixed engines like magic, they tailed the truck under cover of darkness. They stayed far enough back to avoid suspicion, close enough to keep visual contact. Hours passed. The road stretched endlessly. Then, just past midnight, the truck veered off onto a dirt path that led deep into an industrial zone outside Birmingham. No signs, no lights, just a rusted gate and a warehouse barely visible beneath layers of dust and neglect. Paul parked the van behind a line of trees. "This is it," he whispered. Robert adjusted his jacket, checked his boots. "Let's move." They crept forward, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The warehouse buzzed with quiet activity. Men unloading crates, scanning barcodes, loading them into another vehicle. Not company-owned rigs either. These were private haulers, outsiders. Paul pulled out his phone, snapping images through a crack in the wall. Every crate was stamped with the company logo. "Stolen goods," he muttered. And they're shipping them outstate. Robert scanned the faces inside. His jaw tightened. One of the guards was familiar. Tall, lean, cold eyes. A man named Lieutenant Norman Kessler, once a rising star in military intelligence, now a glorified watchman for thieves. Paul saw the shift in Robert's posture instantly, like a door slamming shut. "You know him?" Paul asked. Robert didn't answer right away. "He was one of the ones who testified against me," he said finally. "Swore under oath I'd compromised a mission." Paul glanced between the two men. "He doesn't recognize you?" "Not yet." They needed to move fast. Back at the van, Robert retrieved a small tracking device from a hidden compartment. "If we can tag one of these outbound trucks," he said, "we might get a lead on where this goes next." Paul hesitated. "We don't have much time." Robert handed him the tracker. "Then make it count." Under the cover of darkness, Paul slipped around the side of the warehouse, heart pounding. The outbound truck idled near the loading dock, driver inside smoking a cigarette. He crouched low, reached under the chassis, and attached the device before slipping away unnoticed. By the time they got back to the van, Robert was already pulling up the signal on a tablet. "It's moving," he said, "and it's heading straight to the regional office." Paul stared at the blinking dot. "That means," he trailed off. Robert finished the thought grimly. "This isn't just some rogue operation. It goes all the way to the top." Back in their motel room, tension hung thick in the air. Paul paced, running over everything in his mind. If the regional director was involved, there was no telling how many others were complicit. Exposing this too soon could mean losing everything, and possibly getting killed. "We need more," Paul said finally. "Proof, names, financials, something solid." Robert leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And if they come after us again?" Paul looked at him. "Then we make sure we're ready." There was a long pause. Then Robert stood, walked over to his bag, and pulled out a folded photo. A younger version of him, standing with soldiers he clearly respected. One of them was Kessler. "I spent years trying to forget this face," Robert said quietly. "Maybe it's time I made him remember mine." Paul studied him carefully. There was something final in his tone, a decision made without words. Outside, the wind howled. Somewhere beyond it, the truth was waiting, and they weren't done chasing it yet. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft ding, sealing Paul inside like the final act of a play he'd been writing in his head for weeks. He adjusted his jacket. Real this time, not the worn-out trucker gear that still smelled like diesel and fear. The company logo on the wall reflected in the metal panels. Felt different now, like staring at a face you once trusted, only to learn it had been lying to you all along. When the doors opened, he stepped into the boardroom. Silence fell instantly. The table was full, suits, lawyers, directors, and the man at the center of it all, Alan Griggs, regional director, smiling like nothing was wrong. Paul met his gaze without flinching. "I think we have some things to discuss," he said. It started with the tracker data. Paul had spent the last 2 nights compiling everything: GPS logs, intercepted shipment records, surveillance photos from the warehouse, even the names of the drivers who had unknowingly played a role in the scheme. He matched them with internal routing orders, financial discrepancies, falsified delivery confirmations. Every piece told the same story: corruption, deep and deliberate. Robert sat beside him, arms crossed, saying little. He wasn't there for speeches. He was there for justice. Griggs tried to laugh it off at first. "You expect us to believe some rogue operation hijacked our system without anyone noticing?" Paul leaned forward. "No. I expect you to explain why your personal vehicle was seen entering that warehouse 3 times in the past 6 months." The room shifted. A few murmurs. One of the legal reps scribbled something fast. Then came the second blow. "We've already notified federal investigators," Paul continued. "They'll be reviewing every transaction under your jurisdiction, including those untraceable offshore accounts linked to shell companies." Griggs's smile vanished. Paul didn't wait for a response. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and turned to the CEO seated at the far end of the table. "This ends today," he said. "Or I walk out, take this to the press myself, and let the world decide what kind of company they're trusting with their goods." There was a long pause. Then the CEO nodded. "Start the internal audit." Security escorted Griggs out without a word. Later that evening, Paul found Robert leaning against the hood of his old rig, staring at the horizon where the city lights met the sky. "You did it," Robert said quietly. Paul shook his head. "We did it." Robert gave a short chuckle but didn't look convinced. "Still doesn't change much," he muttered. "I'm not exactly executive material." Paul pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it over. Inside was a contract. Head of Logistics Security, Eastern Division. Robert stared at it for a long moment. "They offered me the position," Paul said. "I declined. Told them I wanted someone with integrity. Someone who knows how this world really works." Robert looked up sharply. "You can't be serious." "I am. You earned this." A silence stretched between them, thick with history, with pain, with the weight of choices made in the dark. Robert finally spoke. "You know what happened to me? What they did?" Paul nodded. "That's why you need to be the one standing guard now." Robert looked down at the contract again, fingers tightening around the edge. For years, he'd driven alone, believing the world had written him off, forgotten, discarded. But here was proof otherwise. Not just a job, a chance to reclaim something he thought was gone forever. After a long breath, he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket. "I'll need a new uniform," he said. Paul smiled. "Already ordered." The next morning, Paul stood outside the main headquarters, watching as the sun rose over the skyline. Behind him, the company was already changing. Investigations were underway. Executives were being replaced. Systems were being audited. And somewhere inside, Robert was stepping into an office he never thought he'd see again. Paul took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. This wasn't how he imagined his journey would go when he first slipped behind the wheel of that beat-up rig. He hadn't expected danger, or betrayal, or redemption, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes the truth doesn't come knocking. Sometimes you have to chase it across highways, through shadows, and straight into the heart of a storm. And sometimes it finds you when you least expect it. In the distance, the sound of engines revved to life. Somewhere down the road, another chapter was waiting. And Paul Rourke, no, not Paul. Not anymore. William Perth, CEO, driver, survivor, was ready to write it. This story makes us reflect on trust, truth, and how sometimes the most unlikely allies are the ones who see the whole picture first. So here's the question. What would you do if you discovered betrayal hiding in plain sight? If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey, where every road leads to revelation.